Hey, New Testament readers, it's week 22. That means just 30 weeks to go. Again, progress. We're getting into this habit. We're learning. We're growing. We've read a lot about Jesus, and that's extremely appropriate. That's what it's all about. All right, so more of the Gospel of John, and we're moving into the latter stages of the Gospel of John with this week's readings. We're going to read the story of Lazarus, which we began last week. Jesus will say before raising Lazarus, "I am the resurrection and the life." And that means if you follow me, if you die, you'll live. And even, that means you will never die. Well, how does that work? It's a never-ending life. It is the life of eternity. It's the life of the new age, without end and full of blessing and abundance. And so Jesus raises Lazarus, which is, this almost next, as we put it in the Gospel of John, as John's Gospel puts it, this is the next to the last thing that John identifies as a sign. And it's the biggest so far. Raising a man from the dead who's been dead and in the tomb for days. Everybody said, don't open the tomb because he's going to smell terrible. But Jesus prays to God and says, glorify yourself in this moment. He doesn't ask God to do the miracle for him, God the Father. He just says, Lazarus, come out. He does this on his own authority, and Lazarus comes out. Well, at the end of chapter 11, this prompts a meeting of the temple leadership in Jerusalem, and they say, we can't have this guy running around. Everybody thinks he's God's true king because he raised someone from the dead. So we're going to have to kill him. Now, why do they say that? Because they believe that if they have a Messiah figure, and the nation unites around that the Romans are going to take up arms and overwhelm them, as the Romans do every time there's a messianic figure. But, if they don't do anything about it, then the Romans are going to kick them out too and put somebody else in their place. So Jesus, in this convoluted way, they see as a threat to their authority and their position. So this is why they make the plot. Interestingly, Nicodemus, who's a member of the council, says, is this lawful for us to do? It's Nicodemus who met with Jesus back in chapter 3, and now he makes another brief appearance in the story. Well, this leads to chapter 12, where we see Jesus anointed by Mary, a story that we also see in the Synoptics. And, we've said there's not much in John that is paralleled in the Synoptics except for the narrative of Jesus' passion, and this is really the beginning of that narrative, and so we'll see the parallels. So from here, we see Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, which is just narrated in a compact way, and his opponents saying the whole world is going after him. We're going to see they're speaking better than they know. This has significance for the whole world. Well, then in chapter 12, we're going to see, as it continues, we see Philip bring some Greeks, that is, non-Jews, to Jesus. In this part of the world, in this period, if you're living in the Jewish homeland, you're either a Jew or a Greek. You're either a Jew or a non-Jew, and one way to refer to a non-Jew is as a Greek. So non-Jews are brought to Jesus, and Jesus says, and all these times he said, it's not my hour, or the Gospel of John has said it was not his hour. He says, now my hour, or now my time has come. Now when these representatives of the whole world are here. He speaks of a grain of wheat only, becoming a stalk if it first falls to the ground and dies. And makes this interesting statement, if I be lifted up, I will draw all people to myself. Lifting up, of course, can mean glorification, but it was also, in Jesus' Aramaic language, a euphemism for crucifixion. So there's a very interesting play on words there, isn't it? And John is going to show us, just as the Synoptics did, that Jesus' crucifixion is ironically his glorification. Well, there's a lot of unbelief going on, of course, in the Gospel of John, and the end of chapter 12 comments on it, just as that Jesus does in the Synoptic Gospels by quoting Isaiah chapter 6. They'll be seeing, but never see, hearing, but never hear. Jesus is treated just as the prophets were before him. Well, in chapter 13, we have Jesus in the upper room at Passover with his disciples. And John shows us Jesus deliberately washing the disciples' feet. We often speak of this as Jesus providing an example to the disciples. And that's exactly how the Gospel of John shows it. He uses the word example. About the only time in the New Testament the word example is actually used, interestingly enough. But along with that example is the demonstration that Jesus is giving. This is what his death means. His death will be cleansing the disciples and Jesus serving the disciples. And so on that basis, he says, I give you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. What's new about that? It's the as I have loved you part. Okay, God has always commanded his people to love one another, but now as I have loved you. And then chapter 14 will begin the farewell discourse of Jesus in chapters 14 to 16, where Jesus is saying, I'm leaving you, but I'm not leaving you alone, because the Spirit is going to empower you to show me to the world. All right, so that's a lengthy introduction to this week's reading. Hope you enjoy it, and I'm glad for the progress you're making.